Moses lay your rod in that Red Sea. Lay your rod, let the children cross in that Red Sea. You host God, Lord, Lord, you host God, Lord, in that Red Sea. Hello, my name is Dr. Robert Cataliotti, and today we're going to be talking about African American slave narratives and the tradition of African American literature. African Americans who were enslaved in the United States created a body of literature, the slave narratives, that is totally unique. Throughout the history of slavery, which has existed in countless cultures throughout the world, throughout history, African Americans were the first group of enslaved people to create a body of literature. In fact, create a genre of literature. The slave narratives served two purposes. They bore witness to the urge to be free and the urge to be literate. African Americans, as we discovered in recent weeks, arrived primarily using an oral tradition carried over the Middle Passage from Africa, and came into contact with a literate tradition used by the Europeans. They quickly realized that there was power in literacy. The earliest examples of African American literature, as we read last week, were modeled on European forms. Phyllis Wheatley wrote poetry in the style of British neoclassicism. Benjamin Banneker wrote his letter to Thomas Jefferson in the formal letter style of the day. Richard Allen used the Protestant sermonic tradition to write his sermons. David Walker wrote his appeal and modeled it on the United States Constitution. But with the slave narratives, this is the first African American form that really forms a building block for the tradition. It's here with the narratives that we get the real beginnings of a distinct African American literature. According to contemporary novelist Ismail Reed, the slave who learned to read and write was the first one to run away. We know from documentation that there were at least 60,000 successful escapes from slavery in the United States. Likely there were many other escapes. However, they remain undocumented. By the Civil War in 1860, 100 book-length narratives had been produced by ex-slaves. By 1944, over 6,000 individuals had narrated in one form or another their tales of enslavement. Many of these were recorded during the early decades of the 20th century by field researchers from the Library of Congress who were sent out into African American communities, particularly in the South, to locate individuals who had experienced slavery firsthand and tell their stories, their recollections, their family memories, and their testimony against the institution of slavery. They are available now on the Library of Congress website. These narratives fulfill the dual purpose. As we spoke of earlier, we talked about the oral tradition, and particularly the call and response form, how it's a performance technique with a voice in dialogue with a chorus, but also that it's symbolic or metaphorical, that in African American expressive culture, call and response is a metaphor for the individual speaking for the community. In much the same way, slave narrators mirrored this. They were tales of individual suffering in slavery, first-hand accounts, factual stories of what was experienced by an individual. However, they represented the communal African American experience. They spoke for, the slave narrative writer spoke for those that were left behind. It was an incredibly popular genre in the 19th century. The 1845 Frederick Douglass narrative sold 5,000 copies in the first 4 months. By 1847, it had sold over 11,000 copies. These numbers may not sound that impressive today, but in the 19th century, Books were regularly shared among people, so that one book that might be in one household would be read by multiple members of the household, by neighbors, by colleagues within the community. Douglas's narrative went through 9 editions in Great Britain, and by 1869 it sold at least 60,000 copies worldwide. And this was at a time when he had already published his second narrative, My Bondage and My Freedom, in 1855. Many of you will be familiar with the movie 12 Years a Slave, Academy Award winner. That was written by Solomon Northup. That narrative, in its first 2 years, sold 27,000 copies. Moses Roper's narrative went through 10 editions between 1837 and 1856, and you can see from the graphic here that it was translated into Welsh, so that these narratives were not only being read in the United States, but they're being read worldwide. Slave narratives, like the oral tradition, were both aesthetic and functional. They were creative, they allowed an opportunity for expression, individual self-expression. They showed the craft and skill of the artist. I mean, when you read Frederick Douglass's narrative, you're going to see what an amazing prose master he was. But the aesthetic value was not the only function. Slave narratives were also functional in that they served a purpose. They did a job. They accomplished something. They worked. And what their job was to do was to help African Americans to resist, survive, and transcend enslavement. Slave narratives were aimed at a white reading audience. They were aimed at getting white people and enlisting them into the anti-slavery cause. We'll talk more about Frederick Douglass's narrative and in particular characteristics of the slave narrative in our next video. Thank you.